Hello everyone. Today I'm going to answer a question from the comments. Here we have Besto. YouTube didn't offer me the video I wanted, so I'm going to just ask it here. Thanks for asking here. I've noticed a little bit of this problem too on YouTube. There tends to be a lot of videos talking about freestyle technique and how to swing nunchakus, but once you start talking about actually hitting stuff, there's really not as much information. So hopefully we can help that here. Hope I can be of some use. The question: how do nunchakus not lose power? As for a stick, there isn't much if a direct hit, but with a nunchaku, shouldn't the piece you hit just go back because of the chain? Or do you hold in a way the chains stop one another, making a temporary stick? All right. So this is a good question. It looks like there might be a little stumbling with wording. I get it. Sometimes you're late. But anyways, the question is about losing energy when you hit because of the cord. And this is a very common misconception and common concern, and it makes a lot of sense, is that because this can move either way like that so easily, you expect once this hits, it's going to come back and you're losing all of the energy in this section of the stick, and that you're not able to contribute anything more, because with a rigid stick, I can use this wrist to help keep this from accelerating backwards. I can push through with it. But with the with the nunchaku, since it's not connected there in a rigid way, you're like, what's going to happen there? And first off, you do lose some energy. But here it's important to put everything in perspective, because a lot of times we tend to think in extremes, like you won't be able to transfer any energy, or you can transfer all of the energy. And in reality, you're always going to be somewhere in between. It's impossible to transfer 100% of the energy, and it's also impossible to transfer 0% of the energy if you're making contact. So it comes down a lot to the concrete scenario you're in, what the target is, what the weapon is, how rigid they are. So in this type of a scenario, we could imagine like a car. If you're going 100 miles an hour in a car and you collide into a wall and you're not pressing on the gas pedal at that moment, nobody's going to say, oh, well, it's not going to transfer any energy. There won't be any force there. On the other hand, you could take the other extreme and, say if you're hitting something with a tennis racket, well, it's not going to have any energy if you don't push through, because the tennis racket is so light. If you're hitting even just a tennis ball and you swing it and have zero follow through, you're going to notice hardly any result. So everything else is going to be somewhere between those two extremes. And I think a really common mistake we see from people is when they take what they've learned in one scenario and try to directly apply it to another. So for instance, in punching, we have a relatively slow moving object with a lot of mass directly behind it. In this case, yes, it's absolutely necessary to follow through, continue applying force through that impact. On the other hand, with an nunchaku, where we're traveling really, really fast, and if we're hitting a hard target like the skull, that contact is going to happen so quickly, and there's such a discrepancy between the size of the weapon and the target that it's going to be hard to make as much impact as you would in a different scenario. So going back to tennis, you've got a soft ball there. You've got, this nice net on the racket, which, it's still pretty stiff, but there's a lot of elasticity going on here that makes it easier to continue powering through and transfer more energy into the ball. And if you try, let's say you take a baseball and try hitting it with a tennis racket, you're going to mess up your arm because it's just really not designed to hit an object that heavy. And that's a little bit of the scenario we run into with an nunchaku, except I'm going to add the caveat here that it is possible to follow through, and it, in many cases, is very important. But part of that depends on what the target is and how much benefit you're going to get from the following through. So, again, the problem with this scenario. Okay? We hit with a stick and we use our wrist and all of this rigidity to transfer, all of the energy into the target, right? Okay. Well, if I'm doing this large swing, first I'm using my legs to generate kinetic energy in my body, which is a very high mass. I'm also using large muscle groups, such as, all of my abs, my chest, my back, to swing back the other way. All of this works together to create a great deal of kinetic energy. And then towards the end of the movement, I change into a phase of concentrating this energy into the target. I do this through centripetal force, pulling in towards my body and transferring this out into this with that swing. And if I'm not doing that, if I keep this rigid the whole time, okay, I'm not going to be able to generate very much speed at all in this tip. And even if I'm holding it in this really nice, wide, solid grip where I can apply good leverage and really get my body weight behind this strike, it's not going to be that damaging simply because there's not that much kinetic energy in the tip. There's not that much speed. Most of it's still stored in my body and in my arms, which is very far away from this point of contact. And it's just a very inefficient way of transferring that energy. So if at all possible, as much as I can transfer the energy into this prior to the strike, the better. So in that case, it ironically becomes better to loosen things up and let it really swing right until I make contact. Now, you'll notice this problem with the stick is that this section is always going to have the same rotational speed as this section. So I can't accelerate this any faster. That means that more of the kinetic energy is always going to be stored in this lower section compared to an nunchaku. Because with an nunchaku, you can see I can get this tip swinging much, much faster than this part. So if you look at where the center of percussion is going to be and where most of the energy is going to be, most of it's going to be in this more compact area, which is great. And it's going to be a little farther up, maybe around 60% through this side. Whereas with the stick, we're going to be about 60% here. And you can see that makes, about like that. That makes quite a difference. So just to begin with, it's easier to transfer kinetic energy into the striking section with an nunchaku to begin with. And also with the stick, you're always losing some of that energy that's stored in the bottom. Even though in our mind this is rigid, it still puts a lot of distance between here, and it tests the mechanical properties of the object. So the longer the weapon is, the thinner it is, right? The more wobbliness you get in it, the less force you're going to get from this kinetic energy. It's not going to immediately connect with that, and you get a lower apparent mass compared to the total mass of the weapon. So again, you're concentrating the same kinetic energy into a smaller mass, and it's more directly connected with the target as you're striking. Now, that brings up the next problem, which is that anytime you hit an object with a higher apparent mass than the weapon, it's going to bounce back. No amount of strong wrist is going to stop that. So if I'm striking, you know, someone's skull, which I think it's like 5 kilograms, you know, or 10 pounds, about that you have in your head, and connecting to this, which is 200 grams, which less than a pound, you know, for this. This is always going to bounce back. Even with this, you get the 400 grams, you know. Okay, so now we're closer to 1 pound instead of half a pound, compared to 10 pounds. So it's always going to bounce back. There's nothing you can do about it. But the smaller it is, the more violently it's going to bounce back, which is kind of an issue. You do have that problem with an nunchaku. It's going to bounce back harder. The upside of that is you're striking with more speed, and so that makes it much more devastating towards smaller targets. So if you're hitting like on the nose, the eyes, the jaw, the teeth, you know, the ear, the fingers, any of these smaller targets are going to be taking more damage from the nunchaku, which has the energy concentrated in a smaller mass at a higher speed. Similar mass target and weapon have better transfer than, you know, if you have one of them grossly outsizing the other. But when it comes to your head, this is where things get weird. If you look at Wushu Engineer's video, he actually showed that with his experiment, it was showing that the nunchaku had the higher apparent mass compared to the stick, because the energy was split up over this whole area, right? All of this mass, and that there's a lot of distance between the point where you're striking and the point storing the kinetic energy. So he was showing actually a higher total force that came through with this, but a lower apparent mass and less power. So that's the amount of force you're applying over time. He showed was a little bit better with the nunchaku, even though the entire energy transfer ended up being a little better with the stick, because it was spread out over more time, because it feels softer. So yeah, those things are a little bit weird, but I mean, again, they're similar enough that you're not going to notice that big of a difference in a lot of scenarios. You're talking 6 of one, half dozen of the other, more often than not. But getting back on point, if we can't transfer this energy with the wrist, which is super weak, right? We have all of this energy that we've developed through the swing, and now we come to this point where this really weak muscle group is supposed to match the force working against this mechanical disadvantage of the leverage at this point of impact. No wrist is going to be strong enough to do that well. So any energy that's in here, anything extra that I'm trying to put into it, is going to be real small potatoes compared to whatever I can get before it. The difference, though, is I can definitely do it if I'm not relying on my wrist, but if instead I'm using major muscle groups pulling towards my body. So instead of going in this type of a follow-through, I'm going in this type of a follow-through. I'm pulling perpendicular to the, you know, vector of the weapon. So I come through and I pull in. I pull in and I just follow through all the way past. And if I'm using 2 hands, I can kind of, like they do in baseball, pull this way. But again, I mean, if you're hitting a tree trunk and you're trying to knock it through like that, a tree being much larger mass, it's going to respond differently than a baseball, which is less mass than the bat. So some things you can carry over, some things you can't. But the main point is that you're pulling instead of moving side to side. Okay? Now, if you'll notice the nunchaku, it's a very good hinge this way. It goes with 0 effort. If I'm pulling, though, this cord is just as strong as the stick. So if I'm pulling through at this point in towards my body, it's going to have this similar effect of making it harder for this to bounce back the other direction. And I can follow through. It'll come back a little bit, but I'll still be able to follow through with the movement unless the rebound on the nunchaku is so high from having such a hard, stiff target that it's going to bounce back anyways. Realistically, again, the tree trunk, I can follow through on that. The problem with that is that if you're off just a little bit, like especially if I'm hitting on the tip, it makes it easier to follow through because I'm not actually transferring all my energy. A lot of this energy here gets stuck and it just follows through. That's bad. Ideally, I want to hit on the center of percussion, okay? But if I hit on the inside of it, okay, and I'm pulling through like that, it makes it much more likely to bounce back and hit me. First, it's going to pull on my hands a lot harder, but you never can be 100% sure when you're in this scenario where things are moving very fast. So that's why, me personally, my technique, if I'm aiming for the main skull, I don't follow through across my body. Okay, I use a different technique where I come through on this way, and instead of pulling towards myself, which is perpendicular and very strong, okay, I pull down, which is still strong. It's much stronger than going side to side. Pulling down is still pretty good. But what happens is it's pulling it now in a different way, perpendicular to the vector of the nunchaku. And as I'm pulling down this way, this is pulling me up and back the other side. So I feel kind of this motion pulling me back in this direction as I'm pulling down here. And then I just let it, after I've pulled down a little bit, I let it pull back up. So immediately before and immediately after the strike, I'm still pulling on this pretty hard. But then afterwards, I just let it come back and pull me ready for a new strike. So I come through once, pull hard, it pulls back, and again, immediately, down, up, down. And it allows you to do your strongest strike, or at least one of your strongest strikes, repeatedly over again because the rebound is setting up your next strike. Whereas if I do follow through all the way, okay, I have to follow it through around, all the way out, then I can come back around this way, but this is not as strong as a strike as this one. And again, if it's bouncing back a little bit unpredictably because I'm a little off, for me personally, it's easier to recover if I'm pulling back. And it really is a matter, enough is enough. When you've practiced hitting different targets and you start developing a feel for what your tool does, like with a hammer, nobody holds a hammer this way and smashes it through. But all the time I see people, especially with backgrounds in swords, trying to hit with the stick this way and hammer through. And it's painful because you're getting no speed in this tip. You're not really transferring that much energy and using the weapon as it's ideally designed to be used. So you just trust in the weapon, in the tool or the weapon for the design of it. I know I'm trying to get enough speed in this section as I can. I have a lot of swinging with the wrist to try to get this going on. And I let the tool do its job. So similar with the nunchaku, let the tool do its job. Gonna bounce back a little bit. Once you get some skill, you'll be able to control that. The amount of energy you transfer and the amount of force and power is more than sufficient in a variety of techniques. So get out there, test different targets, different techniques, find out what works with you. Preferably make more videos on this stuff and share with us your findings, because you know we love to learn from other people who do it instead of just keyboard warriors. I think that was it. Like you said, making a stick out of the nunchaku, if you're pulling it in this way through the strike, it's basically the same as a stick. And that's what you should be trying to do. Pull perpendicular, not exactly in the same direction. And you won't hit yourself, you'll have good follow through, and I guess that's it. Anyways, thanks for a comment. See you guys next time.